Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I realized I was never the problem in my family. I was just the placeholder. When my parents packed up my brother Jake and my sister Lily for a beach resort trip and left me home with the line, "You need to focus on school," I finally stopped feeling guilty and started looking at what was really going on. The words had been repeated so many times that they felt almost automatic, like it was my assigned role to stay back, cover the house, and keep my grades perfect while everyone else enjoyed themselves. At first I sat in the quiet house thinking maybe it was just another example of them being careless, but the more I sat with it, the more I knew I had to look deeper, because their behavior had patterns, and patterns leave trails if you actually bother to follow them. I began with something small. I pulled open the family laptop, the one everyone used, and logged into the bank portal that still had my name attached. It was a custodial account, set up when I was younger, supposedly to help with my future tuition and expenses, the one they always waved around as proof they cared about my education. I had never questioned it because I thought it was locked away until I needed it. But right there in black and white were transfers, not little ones, not one-time mistakes, but steady withdrawals into an account that only had my father's name. I scrolled down, matched dates, and saw something that made my stomach flip. A $5,000 transfer the exact week Jake got his fancy upgrades on the car, and another withdrawal 2 days before they checked into the resort. The pattern was so obvious it was insulting. I felt this mix of anger and calm settle in. Anger because my future was being used as their vacation fund, calm because once you have proof, you stop debating yourself. I called my school counselor, Ms. Alvarez, and asked straight out if I had rights to this money now that I was of age. She explained that yes, the account had been legally mine since my last birthday, and if I wanted to, I could freeze access and move it into my own name. She didn't sound shocked. She just gave me the paperwork steps, which told me this wasn't the first time she had walked someone through a family like mine. That night, I pulled out every photo album in the house. I started scanning them onto a flash drive, picture after picture. At first, it was just for safekeeping, but then I noticed something that hit harder than the missing money. In nearly every family shot, I was either the one holding the camera or cropped halfway out. At birthdays, it was Jake blowing out the candles. At holidays, it was Lily front and center. I was either in the background carrying plates or missing entirely. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It was like the family had been rehearsing the idea of me disappearing for years, and now they had simply gotten bold enough to make it official by leaving me behind. Instead of crying, I started pulling the prints of me off the walls. Not one by one, not dramatically, just practical. I stacked them neatly in a box and set them aside. The frames that were only of the family, without me, I left in place, because they told the truth better than I could. I packed a single suitcase with what I actually cared about: my laptop, documents, the flash drive, and a few notebooks that held my work and ideas. The rest was just clutter that had been assigned to me, not chosen by me. The next morning, I called a number Ms. Alvarez had slipped me for a short-term sublet. A college student was heading abroad and needed someone to cover 2 months of rent. I met the landlord, signed my own name on the lease, and handed over money that was legally mine. For the first time, I paid for my own space without anyone having a say. No begging, no explaining, no "we'll think about it." It was done, and it was mine. Before I left the house, I wrote one letter. I kept it plain and direct, no emotion, just facts. Inside the envelope, I included copies of the bank statements that showed every withdrawal from my account, a tally of hours I had spent babysitting, cleaning, and covering chores in the last 2 years, and a single closing line: I am no longer available for household labor, financial sacrifice, or emotional cleanup. Do not attempt to access accounts in my name again. This is the boundary. I placed it right on the kitchen counter where my mom liked to leave her little sticky notes about groceries. Then I drove away with everything that mattered in the trunk. I didn't slam the door, I didn't scream, I didn't even tell the neighbors. I just made the kind of exit they had been practicing for me in silence all those years. I set up alerts on the bank account that now only I controlled, so that if anyone tried to move a dollar, I would know instantly. I updated my email and phone verification codes. It was clean, legal, and final. My parents could come home to their spotless vacation memories and their carefully framed photos, but they would also come home to a house where my presence had been erased in the most undeniable way. They could call me ungrateful, they could cry to the relatives, they could throw around words like betrayal, but none of that would change the fact that the money was gone from their reach. The photos were no longer their property, and the quiet girl they left behind was no longer waiting for permission. They can call me ungrateful all week if they can find me. When my parents returned from their trip, tanned and relaxed and carrying shopping bags that I knew were bought with money taken directly out of the account that had my name on it, the first thing they did was not ask about me or school, or even whether I had eaten, but rather stormed through the house demanding to know why the walls looked emptier, why the photos that had once shown me half smiling in the background were missing, and why an envelope with my handwriting sat on the kitchen counter, instead of a daughter waiting in her room like nothing had happened. They called me within the first hour, not once but repeatedly, leaving voicemail after voicemail filled with phrases that were less about concern and more about control. My mother's voice rising in practiced hysteria about how family reputation was being destroyed by my dramatic stunt, while my father's messages sounded more like a manager dictating a memo to an employee who had failed to file a report correctly. I did not pick up the phone because I knew exactly how the conversation would go. They would deny, minimize, and then try to guilt me until I felt like the villain in a play they had written. Instead, I sent one single text to both of them: check the envelope. That was all, no explanation, no back and forth, because I had already given them everything they needed to understand and more than enough to answer the question they would pretend not to comprehend, which was how their daughter had finally reached the point of walking out quietly instead of begging for a seat at the table. The reaction was predictable, almost boring in its lack of creativity. My mother left long voice notes about how I was tearing the family apart, how people at church and extended relatives would whisper, how she had always done her best, and how I was cruel to repay her sacrifices this way. My father, on the other hand, responded with bullet point style texts that broke down into numbered demands, as if this were some quarterly performance review. I was to return home immediately. I was to apologize to my siblings for making them uncomfortable, and I was to restore the family image by removing the accusations. The contrast between their tones made me laugh for the first time in weeks, because it showed so clearly what I had always known deep down. My mother cared about how things looked, my father cared about control, and neither of them cared enough to simply ask me what I needed. Rather than waste my time arguing, I opened my laptop, wrote one calm and carefully worded email with the subject line "boundary," and sent it to both of them. In the body, I listed 3 simple conditions. First, they were not to touch or access any accounts or documents in my name ever again. Second, they were not to show up at my school or my new address without being invited. Third, they were not to speak for me to extended relatives, teachers, or anyone else. There were no threats, no insults, no dramatics. Just 3 lines that cut off the main pipelines of control they had always relied on. Then I forwarded the same information to Aunt Denise, who had always been the only adult in the extended family, who said what she actually thought instead of smiling through hypocrisy. I included the bank statements that showed exactly where the money had gone, with dates and amounts highlighted, and I didn't even need to write an explanation because the numbers spoke louder than any speech. Within a day, she had replied with a single sentence that confirmed I had chosen the right person. I knew something was off. Thank you for showing me the truth. That Sunday, while my parents tried to sit through brunch at Grandma's house and spin a story about me, acting out and being influenced by bad friends, Aunt Denise set her fork down, looked straight at my mother, and asked why Emily's college funds had been drained to pay for cocktails by the beach. I wasn't there in person. I had no desire to sit at a table where the only role offered to me was scapegoat, but I knew the impact, because silence fell across that table like a dropped plate, and for once my parents were the ones being stared at instead of me. While they scrambled to patch their reputation with excuses and half-truths, I was already several steps ahead. I had scheduled something on the family shared drive, the one they used to store albums and holiday photos that were supposed to prove how perfect we looked together. At noon sharp, a slideshow appeared titled Family Album. Inside were every photo they had ever tried to crop me out of, uncropped and restored, with my face and presence impossible to ignore. Each file was labeled with the original date, nothing more, no captions, no comments, no angry notes, just the raw evidence of how long they had been practicing the art of editing me out. I didn't need to be in that kitchen or that dining room to feel the discomfort spread, because I knew exactly what it would feel like when relatives opened those photos and saw the difference. My parents could tell any story they wanted with words, but images cut through faster than explanations ever could, and the truth was that they had been erasing me long before I ever packed a suitcase. By the end of that weekend, I had voicemails from Jake, who told me I had embarrassed Mom and ruined the family standing, and from Lily, who sounded confused and a little scared, asking me why people were fighting and whether I was angry with her. I didn't answer Jake, because his loyalty had always been bought with gifts and indulgence, but I texted Lily back gently that I loved her, that none of this was her fault, and that sometimes the only way to make things right is to stop covering up what has been wrong for years. As my parents scrambled to contain the damage, as relatives whispered questions they could not answer without lying, and as the photos sat stubbornly on the drive with my face refusing to disappear, I realized something important. I didn't have to yell. I didn't have to fight. I didn't have to convince anyone. All I had to do was show the truth plainly and stop cleaning up their mess. Funny how people lose their appetite when the room stops clapping. By the time the first round of family theater died down and the relatives had moved on from shocked silence to cautious side conversations, my parents reached for the lever they had always believed would snap me back into place, which was the promise that they could pick up a phone, call an office, and speak to someone in a voice that sounded official enough to unlock doors that did not belong to them. So while my voicemail filled up with messages about consequences and responsibilities and how I was endangering my future by being stubborn, I opened my laptop, took a deep breath that did not shake, and began doing the quiet, unglamorous work of making it legally impossible for them to treat my life like a shared account that any authorized adult in our house could access whenever it suited them. I emailed Ms. Alvarez with a subject line that simply read, "Next steps," and in the body I wrote that I was ready to formalize what we had discussed, which included withdrawing blanket consents that had been signed when I was younger, updating all records to reflect that I would be the sole point of contact for anything related to my education, and ensuring that no one, not even a parent, could call an office and sweet-talk their way into my grades, my financial aid, or my schedule. And within an hour, she replied with a checklist so crisp and precise that I felt something inside me settle, because it turns out the strongest kind of calm arrives when you realize you do not have to argue about your boundaries if you can document them instead. We started at the registrar, where I filled out the form that revoked prior permissions and replaced them with my signature alone, and then we walked to the financial aid office, where I verified that all communications would go directly to my email and not to the family account that my mother monitored as if it were a neighborhood watch, and then we stopped by the counseling center, where I signed a simple line affirming that no records could be shared without my express say-so, and as we moved from office to office, I watched the paper trail grow into a quiet wall that would not raise its voice and would not get tired, because it was built of policy and timestamps and names that matched mine. Next, I looked at every place where my parents had once claimed they were only helping, which turned out to be a polite way of saying monitoring, so I changed my emergency contacts to Aunt Denise and to a calm, decent adult I had met through my roommate named Marcus, who answered the phone on the first ring and said he would be honored to be listed because it mattered to him that I felt safe, and then I called my pharmacy to transfer prescriptions to a branch near my sublet, which involved answering a few routine questions, and then choosing a 4-word phrase that only I would know to use for verbal verification, a silly little step that felt surprisingly strong, like a latch sliding into place on a door that had always stood open. Because I understood that control also hid in the small digital spaces where convenience had slowly blurred into surveillance, I cleaned house there too, setting up 2-factor authentication on my school account, on my bank, on my email, and on the cloud storage that held the scanned photos, Then I rotated passwords and removed saved devices that I recognized as the family laptop and my mother's tablet, which had logged in often under the excuse of helping me organize, and when the pop-up window asked if I was sure I wanted to sign out all other sessions, I clicked yes with a kind of relief that felt like a bruise finally being left alone. When my father arrived at the school office unannounced, carrying the particular tone he used when he wanted people to believe he was the most reasonable person in the room, he was met by a receptionist who had been briefed and a registrar who had my paperwork in the system, and together they delivered the most boring sentence in the world, which, if you have ever been on the receiving end of a lifetime of overreach, is also the most beautiful sentence, namely that they could not share that. And watching from a distance as the old power play failed without drama gave me a kind of secondhand closure I was not expecting, because I did not have to be there to make it happen. I had only to follow the steps and trust the process that protects students who decide to speak for themselves. Jake texted me with a half-joke about how I had turned the school into a fortress and how Dad was furious because people he knows were not being nearly as helpful as usual, which told me every piece of this was working, while Lily, who still leads with kindness even when she is lost, wrote that she did not understand why I was shutting everyone out and asked if there was a way to make it all go back, and I told her as plainly as I could that I loved her and that I was not shutting anyone out so much as closing doors that had never been theirs to walk through in the first place, and I added one small piece of advice that she could tuck away for later, which was to keep copies of her own records because ownership of your life starts with ownership of your paperwork. Because I had learned that the only thing stronger than a boundary is proof that you set it before anyone could claim confusion, I propped my phone against a stack of books and recorded a single, calm video addressed to my parents where I stated the date and time, affirmed that I was of age, and said the words that matter in any dispute over access, which are that I withdraw consent for them to act for me, to request information about me, or to represent me in any setting, and then I saved the file in a folder whose title included the name of a lawyer Aunt Denise had recommended, not because I planned to fight a war in court, but because people who rely on soft intimidation grow very quiet when they realize you have receipts organized in a way that strangers with authority will understand. While the old habit of control tried one last gasp through relatives who told me I was overreacting and would regret embarrassing my parents, the new system I had built kept doing exactly what I designed it to do, which was to hold steady without my constant attention, and in that steadiness, I finally felt the absence of a noise I had lived with for years. A noise made of footsteps in hallways and unlocked files and shared passwords and the constant fear that someone might make a call that changed my plans without even telling me, and in that quiet I realized that I had reclaimed something bigger than a stack of documents, because I had reclaimed the right to decide who hears my voice and who does not. They always said they knew people. Turns out, I did too. By the time my parents realized that their direct attempts at control had been quietly dismantled one form at a time, and that their usual tricks of guilt and intimidation had lost their effect, they did what they had always done best, which was to redirect the story outward and start working the sympathy circuit with anyone willing to listen, because when your own house begins to crack you look for fresh walls to lean on, and they believed if they could spin the right version of events fast enough, people would ignore the evidence I had already put in place and go back to nodding along with the picture-perfect narrative they had curated for years. My mother began posting vague little lines on her social circles about how children today don't understand sacrifice, about how parents are never appreciated until it's too late, and about how she was suffering from betrayal inside her own home, while my father played the part of the stoic man weighed down by family burdens, dropping heavy sighs at Sunday gatherings, telling anyone who asked that he didn't know what went wrong, and making it sound as if I had been seduced by some dark outside influence instead of simply tired of being erased. What they had not counted on was that I had finally understood something that had taken me years to see clearly, namely that the people who matter most in the ecosystem of a family's reputation are not the crowd who clap politely at every staged announcement, but the few who actually keep records, manage committees, sign off on scholarships, and balance community budgets, because those are the people who know the difference between a story and a receipt, and when they see numbers they do not forget them. So instead of trying to match my parents' performance on social media or wasting breath trying to correct every whispered half-truth, I prepared a small, neat packet addressed to exactly two people whose voices carried more weight in our community than any dozen carefully framed family photos. Our pastor's wife, who quietly ran half the volunteer boards and had the kind of memory for detail that made people nervous, and the head of the scholarship committee, who had once asked me why my application showed no parent contribution despite our household income being comfortably above the line. The packet was not emotional, it was not dramatic, it was not even particularly long. It contained my work log of household hours that had cut into school clubs and after-school opportunities, copies of bank transfers showing how my educational account had been steadily drained for vacations and luxuries unrelated to me, and a simple timeline that matched withdrawals with family emergencies that in reality had turned out to be Jake's car upgrades or Lily's extracurricular trips. I added one cover note at the top that said only, "I am providing this for clarity," nothing more, because clarity was exactly what my parents had always been allergic to, and when clarity steps into the light, spin loses its air. A week later, the response arrived, and it was as precise and cold as any judgment handed down from a bench, though it came in the form of a single sentence from the scholarship head: "Thank you for the clarity." No dramatics, no promises, no comforting platitudes, just acknowledgement that the truth was now in the record where my parents could no longer pretend it did not exist. That one line was more powerful than any argument I could have staged in person, because it confirmed that the version of the story they had been shopping around was already beginning to lose oxygen. Meanwhile, Jake decided to intervene in the only way he knew how, which was with anger dressed up as brotherly authority, calling me to yell about how I was making mom look bad and how I was hurting the family's name. I listened long enough to catch my breath and then replied with a single sentence that silenced him harder than a scream ever could: "I did not make her look anything. I stopped covering it." And before he could gather himself to respond, I sent him a document that detailed a repayment plan for the money siphoned from my account into his car upgrades, with proof attached, and while he laughed at first and told me I had lost my mind, he made the mistake of replying whatever in text when I told him that agreement to the plan could be as simple as acknowledging receipt, and that one word, sealed in writing, was all I needed. What Jake did not know was that I had set up an auto-debit arrangement tied to the agreement, and on the first date outlined in the schedule, a small but undeniable withdrawal left his account and landed in mine. Not enough to ruin him, but enough to remind him that accountability has weight when you sign your name, even casually. He could dispute it if he wanted, he could rant about unfairness, but the reality was that I now had proof of his acknowledgement, and the law doesn't care if you smirked while typing the word whatever. For the first time, repayment was not theoretical, it was tangible, and it was mine. All the while my parents were still scrambling, still trying to paint me as ungrateful, still insisting that I had been manipulated into rebellion, but the damage to their image was not being done by me directly. It was happening because the structures they leaned on had started to see the truth written out clearly in receipts, records, and repayment schedules that contradicted their lines. I didn't need to scream about betrayal or cry for attention. I just had to keep letting the daylight in, because once people see the truth laid out in daylight, they cannot unsee it, and every denial sounds like noise against the backdrop of evidence. As Jake fumed about his drained account and my parents scrambled to hold together a reputation that was now fraying faster than they could patch it, I sat in my sublet and asked myself a question I had been circling for weeks, but never said out loud, which was whether I was done or whether I was finally ready to name the full truth, the kind of truth that changes everything when spoken directly. Next, I had to decide if I was done, or if I was finally ready to say out loud what I knew. When I finally reached the point where the noise of accusations, guilt trips, and half-baked justifications no longer rattled me, I realized the last step wasn't about money or accounts or even community reputation, but about reclaiming the truth of who I had been all along and refusing to let that truth be dictated by people who had spent years trimming me out of the frame. So instead of waiting for them to offer a version of reconciliation that would never come, I chose to deliver my own final act, One that would be both a closing statement and an opening door, a line drawn not for drama, but for survival. I arranged a call where I would not be alone, because I had learned that battles fought in private with my parents always ended with them twisting the story, so I asked Aunt Denise to sit beside me and witness everything. And with the phone on speaker, I told my parents plainly that this conversation was not about begging or accusations, but about putting into words what I had already proven through action. I explained, slowly and without raising my voice, that the cropped photos, the erased records, the drained funds, the endless chores that ate up my hours while Jake enjoyed every opportunity and Lily was shielded from every responsibility, had formed a pattern so clear and undeniable that pretending otherwise would only insult us all, and I reminded them that the pattern had a cost, not just for me, but for the version of family they claimed to value so much. I told them I was no longer willing to participate in that pattern, not as the background figure, not as the invisible worker, not as the extra body they forgot to count when ordering vacation tickets. I told them I had moved forward, I had secured my own place, I had reclaimed my own money, and I had established boundaries that would not bend no matter how many relatives they tried to rally or how many public sighs they performed. And then, because I wanted the truth to sting the way it had always stung me in silence, I revealed what I had found tucked away in an old folder, a childhood care plan where my mother's handwriting had casually noted, "Emily manages better when ignored." I said it out loud so they could hear the ugliness of it bounce off the walls. I was not a care plan. I was your daughter. The silence on the other end stretched long, the kind of silence that used to scare me, but now it only proved that they had no script prepared for honesty spoken without apology. I didn't fill the silence. Instead, I laid out the terms as calmly as if I were reading directions on a map. No contact for a set period of months unless they agreed to mediation with a neutral third party, and repayment of the remainder owed from my account, with documentation to confirm it. If they complied, a conversation might be possible in the future. If they refused, then I would be fine without them, because I had already proven that my survival no longer hinged on their approval or their control. To seal it, I mailed them a box that arrived 2 days later, small and ordinary on the outside, but inside it contained every original photo print of me they had shoved into drawers and never displayed, the snapshots of birthdays where I was off to the side, the school events where I stood blurred in the corner, the moments they had decided were not worth remembering publicly. On top of the pile I placed one single photo of me smiling, not posed or cropped, taken years earlier by Aunt Denise, and on the back I wrote 6 words that carried more weight than any speech: "I am not missing. I'm here." I kept the digital archive for myself, every scanned copy stored safely in a place they could not touch, because those images belonged to me, and they told my story whether my parents wanted to admit it or not. With the box sent and the terms spoken, I stepped fully into the new chapter one had been building quietly while they fought to repair a version of the past that no longer held power. I moved into a stable apartment with a roommate who respected space, a lock code I set myself, and furniture bought with money that was mine by right, not loaned out with strings attached. Marcus helped me haul a heavy bookshelf up the stairs without asking for backstory or making me feel like I owed him explanations, and that kind of ordinary kindness felt like the beginning of a different kind of family, one chosen rather than assigned. I started tutoring for extra income, my scholarship paperwork now corrected thanks to the clarity I had provided, and for the first time in my life, I looked at my calendar and saw only commitments I had chosen rather than obligations forced onto me. I didn't know whether my parents would ever accept mediation, whether they would ever acknowledge the repayment plan, or whether they would cling forever to the idea that I was the ungrateful problem. That part was no longer mine to solve. What mattered was that I had erased the erasure, that I had taken the invisible girl they had pushed out of frames and turned her into a woman who stood firmly in her own story. I did not burn a bridge, because burning implies finality and rage, and I wasn't interested in destruction for its own sake. I built a gate, and on that gate I placed a lock that only I could open, with terms that had to be respected before anyone was allowed to walk through. Whether they ever approached that gate with sincerity was their choice, not mine, and for the first time, The balance of choice was where it belonged. I am not missing. I am not erased. I am here, and this time, I am the one holding the key.